For instance, 20 years ago, people were very dismissive, the world over, of unmanned systems itself. Then now we are at a stage where we talk a lot about manned and unmanned. Now,
that if you take the unmanned route, it breeds a certain amount of instability, I would say, because if you're not losing people and if you're only going to use machines in conflict, then your propensity to use that tool is going to increase with time. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Dabolim Dialogues. Once again, I'm delighted to have as my guest Admiral Shrikhande. He is well known to all of you. Today, I thought we'll do something contemporary, and I thought we would discuss modern day wars. And one really important aspect of these modern day conflicts, I would say, is the use of drones and unmanned systems. We've seen it in starting, I would say, extensive use, starting with the conflict in Azerbaijan with Armenia. And then after that, of course, in the Ukraine conflict, I think it's taken a totally new dimension. We've seen the use of drones even by the Houthis in the Red Sea. And more recently, of course, in Operation Sindoor also, extensive use of drones has been done by both sides. Now, drones as we know it, I mean, we normally associated it with something contemporary, but they have been in use for decades together, I would think so.
Yes.
So let me start with that. Would you like to give us a historical perspective on the use of drones? And also, maybe you, at the same time, is there really a distinction between from a philosophical standpoint at least, between the missile and the drone? I mean, you've got weapons in the past also, I would say, during the Cold War, like you've had first-person view, for example, is regarded as something which is quite contemporary. But TV guidance of a missile and first-person view, I think, is almost identical in a sense.
Yes.
So you've had, I was just reading today, you've had weapons like the Martel, which was used by the Buccaneer bombers in the 1970s by UK, where the pilot actually had a view of the a television picture from the nose cone of the missile and had to physically guide the missile onto its target.
Yes.
Very much like a drone operator does today in an FPV drone. So in a way, these are all, this story is not new, it's being repeated.
True.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, Monty, you're absolutely right, and this is one of those issues that we tend not to look back a little bit into history to see that many of the things we imagine are conceptually new are not conceptually new. In terms of certain technologies, of course, they would be new, but not conceptually. So you said that drones have lasted for a few decades, and that's absolutely right. One could say that as we understand today, an unmanned vehicle which and a drone is an unmanned vehicle. Satellites with the Soviet era Sputnik were the first sort of unmanned drones. They just happened to be satellites, and the term drone was never used for them. And they went around without any person in there, but with ground stations, which got data from them. And if we recall, in the first couple of years or first few years, there was such poor connectivity and radio in that way that went into space and got back signals or pictures. Digital pictures were not possible, and therefore at some of the passes, the satellite used to eject their film cassette,
Right.
which would be then recovered on ground, and it would come through parachutes. And all that changed now. So, but fundamentally, you're right that drones have been existing for a long time, and in a way that the viewers should look at the only sort of manned weapons that one can think of were actually swords and clubs, where the platform, as a human being, males in the most part, but there were notable feminine exceptions also to that, carried a sword or a club in their hand, and the weapon and platform were fused at that time. But arrows, archers, arrows, spears, and then even the earliest of muzzle loading guns, etc., all now created ordnance that was unmanned.
Right.
And therefore now we are talking about the missile age, which has been with us for decades. And you are also right that terms like first person view, drones, etc., are misleading. You rightly brought out TV guidance. The forms of guidance, or the speed with which, and the clarity with which you can get a picture and analyze it, of course, is changing. So yes, quite a lot has changed, but in some ways, the
more
past
precise.
provides us some anchoring of the present.
So moving on from there, so like you mentioned that in the old days it used to be the sword, and then it became the bow and arrow, which was really a projectile that followed a ballistic trajectory and then hit its target, etc. I mean, what used to happen in earlier generation weapons is that the platform had all the intelligence, and the weapon, if it was a projectile from a gun or from a piece of artillery, was scarcely had any intelligence. You can say you might then, as things developed, the intelligence in the weapon started increasing with time. I would say the earliest may have been the proximity fuse, which was a form of intelligence that went into the into the round itself. And with time, that you gave it its own propulsion, you gave it its own seeker, you gave it its navigation system, you gave it an ability to move from place to place, you gave it long range. So a lot of the intelligence that used to be resident in the platform has now been transferred into the weapon. And as a consequence of that, the platform need not be that capable, in a sense, provided you have a network or resident information and intelligence and artificial intelligence to an extent which is resident in the weapon itself. So actually, I'm sort of trying to figure out between when we design or when we look at future procurements in armed forces, and I'm not speaking only of India, it's really generic in nature, is the platform becoming less important with the weapon becoming more important? And therefore you can start, qualities like speed, stealth, range, endurance, these, which require an enormous amount of resources which have to be devoted to the platform. Is it time that we made a subtle shift to start under-investing in the platforms and investing more in the weapons itself? So that's the fundamental question.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that proposition, and the reality. In fact, it's no longer a proposition. That's what seems to be happening all over the world now. And what is happening is that since weapon ranges, weapon speeds, weapon accuracy, lethality of each weapon has improved a lot over the past few decades. Because of that range, now the standoff attack capability has improved, and therefore the platform now often does not need to go into harm's way, so to speak, as happened earlier when those ranges were shorter, and that's been evident in across decades now. So yes, the platform now can be further and further away from where the platform itself is vulnerable, and that is what seems to be happening. And the Ukraine Russia conflict actually gives us a good example of how, what in what hard ways did we learn those lessons, or we are looking at those lessons. For instance, in the initial parts, there was a lot more use of fixed wing aircraft, combat aircraft by both sides.
Right.
And of course, Ukraine hardly had any, and the Russian Air Force had several times more. But based on the degree of losses they suffered, there was now a tendency to keep their combat aircraft further away and use them as launch platforms for long range weapons, and also use exactly what you said, unmanned platforms like drones that launched weapons. So in land warfare, a small drone with just one small grenade can create so much devastation to a fighting vehicle or a bunker than perhaps would have required a lot more artillery, which would have of course been more lethal, but it might have been less accurate. So this is where the balance between accuracy and lethality
Right.
works. And you're right, therefore, in suggesting that the importance at one stage, given maybe even a decade or 2 decades ago, to platform stealth, to platform speed, and sheer platform maneuverability has reduced. And we find that most unmanned aerial vehicles today are slower, uh, smaller, and in some ways platform to platform less capable, but they have the great virtues of being able to go into harm's way without their deployers worrying about casualties, without the political leadership thinking too much about casualties. So yes, this is a huge change that seems to be happening. And I think, as you mentioned, Operation Sindoor is a good demonstration of our side being alive to this issue, and we can already see the fruits of that effort that has been put in.
So that's a very valid point you've raised, sir, and that, in a sense, that if you take the unmanned route, it it breeds a certain amount of instability, I would say, because if you're not losing people, and if you're only going to use machines in conflict, then your propensity to use that tool is going to increase with time. And particularly if you club it with, with greater battlefield awareness, where you have much greater visibility, and if you have the ability and the range to hit a large number of targets without the concomitant loss of human lives, from your side at least, then I would say the tendency and the desire to use these sort of weapons will, you feel it will lower the bar for conflict in a way?
Yes, I think we see that happening in our contemporary times, but there's an echo of it in the past also, that the moment your own soldiers or sailors or airmen are under less threat because of the asymmetric differential between having much of the power and the other side that you're targeting having lesser power, we can take military decisions to go to war. Of course, it requires political
Right.
approval, but it becomes easier, and that is the point. I think great point that you made is that the political decision to go to war for certain political objectives may fade away, and the military capability might come to the forefront. And military, I mean, armed forces are just an instrument of gaining political objectives, and I think that should not be forgotten. But what you said, I mean, what do you feel? How are the Houthis looking at it? Because as one sees, a quasi-state group has developed so many drones and so many missiles, and are taking on much larger adversaries, especially if we see that the main adversary there, as
Is
from
the
their
US Navy.
perspective, is the US Navy and the US Air Force, etc. So while they have been pounding Houthi strongholds where such weapons or platforms exist, they have not really achieved the desired success, and the Houthis can still exercise a fair bit of influence
Right.
towards and attaining, probably they might be closer towards their political objectives than the other sides, whose political or stated objective of all this is to keep freedom of the seas
Right.
going. So do you feel here also there is a lesson in terms of non-state actors, and how might it apply to the previous week of Op Sindoor, where non-state actors and state actors are on the same side in Pakistan? and there's very little to differentiate their locations or anything of that sort, and yet it required a lot of circumspection from our side in choosing precise targets, which was a very good thing.
Right.
And then the escalation was from the other side. So do you feel that was that was also a good plan and a good sort of operational and tactical measures for the political
Right.
objectives? And how do you see the difference between, say, what the Houthis are doing and what happened in the past weeks?
So, I mean, democratization, the main things are what has enabled people is democratization of technology and of possession of weapon systems. So, in a sense, really, that because these weapons are available to them, it gives you the ability to act in that way. I mean, who would have thought that a small militant outfit like the Houthis will be that disruptive that you can stop traffic going through the Suez Canal practically? I mean, unless it's diminished by 60-70%. I mean, that's what the last, and I don't think even after the US intervention, that number has gone up significantly. I mean, so
you're right.
it's still pretty low. So once you have the ability, then it gives you capability. And the thing is that I think we're in that section of the the technology curve where non-state actors have got weapons which are quite powerful, and you're using your old conventional defense architecture to take them down, which is an expensive architecture. Particularly when it comes to against ballistic missiles and things like that, you're using your BMD architecture, which is a hugely expensive because cost was no consideration. Now, if these things are coming to you in large numbers, then weapon systems have to change, where you have to develop kinetic energy, low-cost weapons to be able to take out these and drone swarms, etc., in pretty large numbers. Because finally, even if you're hit by a swarm of drones, okay, they might carry only a 2 kg, 3 kg explosive. But if he goes and hits one of your arrays of your spy radar or something like that, at least you're going to degrade the performance of that radar, and then you're in a decision dilemma whether you should continue operating that way or you head home and get it sorted out. And if you expend your ammunition rapidly in trying to deplete, then again another decision dilemma. And the third dilemma we also talked about earlier is that when you have low-cost weapons getting thrown at you and you've got a layered defense system, but it's a difficult decision for a commanding officer to take, saying that I'll let the low-cost weapon penetrate to my third layer and then take it down with the third layer of defense.
Yes.
Because you're operating at extended ranges from your bases. If you're hit, you're going to go back a long way. So your tendency is to use your first layer to take down whatever's coming your way. And therefore, and those are expensive and finite, I mean, at the end of the day. So that is an issue. And coming back over here, sir, I think it was right in this case that we made this distinction. But going ahead, I think it's an unfair, it's an unfair demand placed on a nation where you have state-supported terrorists, and you use your connections with that organization to your advantage. That when it's to your advantage, you support them. When it's to your disadvantage, you say they're on their own.
Yes.
So, as a nation that is facing this challenge, I think going ahead, it will be difficult to continue the way we are, that we make this distinction at all times between what is, where the state ends and where the non-state starts. And this is one continuum in a way. And therefore, I think in the way we reacted, showed it in the second phase at least.
That's right.
That, we accept it as one continuum.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's not that just because you claim that you have, certain organizations which are acting on their own, but if they're acting from your soil, and if you can't take care of them, then we are fully in our rights, to do, not only take them out, but even the support systems. But I want to change tack a little bit over here and ask you another question. Is that what we are seeing is that if you have long range assets, I mean, if you have in terms of missiles, strike capabilities, drones that can go out for thousands of kilometers, or not thousands, maybe 1,000 or 1,500, 2,000 kilometers, is the requirement to have weapons on mobile platforms like aircraft and ships diminishing? And is it when you can very well launch the same platforms from the land itself? Land brings you certain advantages. Land cannot fall out of the sky, it cannot sink. You can distribute, you can harden, you can camouflage. I mean, some things you can do at sea also, and you can replenish quite easily because your factories are located in the same medium, so that you can always bring them back. Yeah. So, moving ahead, is it possible that your seaborne and airborne assets, and I'm talking about not only restricted to the Navy but in all services, that their mission sets might diminish and become more niche for specific missions, and the land itself might address more of these mission sets, particularly when you have a common border. If you're expeditionary, I can understand that you have to go out a long way and then to deploy those weapons. But if you have a common border, then would the land tend to dominate in terms of a weapon launch platform?
It could happen, and I've tried to sort of write about this as the greater role the fort can play, against the fleet, and that's been increasing now. Whether we call it the Chinese active defense or A2AD as the West calls it, a lot of their strength is in unmanned ordnance that will fly from land, or unmanned ISR that will fly from land and be able to do ISR over sea, do targeting over sea, and that is a trend that we need to watch for. And you're right, that while there might be cultural resistance to recognizing this trend, we all navies need to be alive to this trend, because things are changing, and the sooner we start accepting that things could change, the more we will actually move towards changing that reality. And I agree that there would be lots of missions where the older platforms, the larger platforms would continue to have their utility, but in time, in decades to come, that utility might decline. I would like to add a little bit about the countermeasures that you brought up in the previous discussion, and that is that in some cases, at least in terms of non-state actors, they do not require the kind of countermeasures against some of the newer ways in which drones and ordnance that is launched by drones, or missiles that can be launched from elsewhere. They might not need drone countermeasure systems. They might not need anti-missile systems the way organized forces and states might need to do. And we see that with the Houthis. And you're right, absolutely, that the Houthis are also taking tactical countermeasures by distributing themselves, and yet having the concentrated lethality by distributed assets which can launch these things. So that part remains important, and therefore, while measures, we are talking about drones and missiles or ordnance that drones can launch, or the developing types of long range ordnance, whether hyperglide weapons or anything else that is on drawing boards, or perhaps being tested now actively by some nations. If that will continue to develop, but we have to also develop countermeasures to that. And we saw a fair bit of talk about that, and I was very happy to see an MOD brief on this today, on some of the countermeasure development, etc., that are taking place. So countermeasures are also equally important as we go ahead to develop that. So we need, India needs to really indigenize even more measures that are better poised for future challenges, and countermeasures that can counter whatever it is that likely adversaries and known adversaries can use against us.
So just another issue I would like to address when it comes to going unmanned as we move ahead. Of course, in which sectors are we seeing the biases taking place? I mean, I would say that you mentioned space. I mean, it's extremely difficult to put a human being permanently in space. and therefore it lends itself, I would say, to go unmanned as soon as possible. The other areas I would say where it is expensive, complex, and very demanding is one is in aerial platforms, and the other I would say is undersea platforms.
Yes.
Aerial platforms, of course, firstly, a pilot has got his own weight. He requires his support systems, he requires his ejection system, he requires oxygen, he requires safety, he requires the aircraft has to be designed with certain, even though an airframe might be able to take more G, you have to be cognizant of the fact that the human being cannot go beyond a certain point. G suits, communication systems, of course, even that might exist if you go unmanned, and therefore it lends itself in a sense for early adoption of going unmanned.
Yes.
Similarly, underwater, because underwater also, if you see, the moment you put human beings inside a submarine, a whole life support system has to kick into place. I mean,
Absolutely.
oxygen regeneration systems and, berthing, bunking, water, food, damage control, fumes. There are many factors which come into play where you have to take care of the human beings. So, would you say that these are the sectors or the regions where we're going to see early adoption? I would say some signs we're already seeing of going unmanned, and maybe on things like land or even shipborne surface ships, etc., where it lends itself for a later adoption of going unmanned.
Correct. I entirely agree with that. And if you see, not only underwater but on surface itself, the kind of sort of unmanned developments that are taking place. And when we were discussing, you mentioned about what happened in the Black Sea
Right.
with the Ukrainian drone, which you could, perhaps talk about. But leaving that part for it, here, there are just so many unmanned underwater vessels that are coming up, whether the Australian ones or the American ones. I think the Australian call it the XL AUV, extra large AUV, and the Orca, or what Austral is making, like a it's a optimally crewed, which is another way of saying, an unmanned vessel can be manned when required, and that is perhaps another way to explore how do smaller ships, offshore patrol vessels, ships that might do constabulary duties in a manned way, but be able to be deployed unmanned in higher risk conflicts, perhaps. So there are these areas where we need to really think about, and this is one area where a lot of innovation and improvisation is required, both in ideas, tactics, and technology itself. How to harness what is available today towards these objectives, and also how to think of other types of technologies that will be required. And some of the bigger challenges would be, for in the underwater domain, is how are you going to track the unmanned vessels, and how are you going to monitor that they're doing their job, and how are you going to know what is it that they might have destroyed, and thereafter plan for further tactical issues. So battle damage assessment using unmanned aircraft requires a whole lot of other unmanned wherewithal to be able to figure out, or manned wherewithal coming in. So this is where big data analytics will come in, autonomous intelligence will come in. So and as you mentioned, it would be great if you spoke a little bit about what happened in the Black Sea, how an air-to-air missile was adapted.
So let me, in fact, that's another area which I want to discuss was this whole question of unmanned teaming, and coming to the Black Sea, of course, I would say is a case of unmanned teaming, where you had this the standard Ukrainian Magura unmanned surface vessel, small fellow with I think it's got diesel driven, of course. But for the first time, I think you have to give it to the Ukrainians. You pop in two SAMs. I mean, the AIM-9 is an air-to-air missile, and now you pop them on a surface ship, and not a ship, a surface craft. And then you go ahead and you take it to the eastern part of the Black Sea, and you knock down 2 Sukhois. I mean, so they claim at least. I can see numerous complexities in doing something like this. Firstly, it's the platform itself. I mean, it's a small platform bouncing around in seas. You don't have a stabilization system, so to speak, I'm sure, because these missiles are fairly large and heavy. If you put in a stabilizer over there, it will be more than the weight of the craft itself, I'm sure. Then numerous other issues come into play. When do you power on the missiles? Yeah. When do you make sure the missile is pointed in the right direction of where the aircraft is supposed to be? So you have to have a highly networked system which can tell you as to where, relative to the craft, where the aircraft is, power on the missile, make sure it points in the right direction, make sure you're not getting swamped by seawater at that time, etc., which might be do some harm to the missiles when they're taking off at that time. Acquire the target and then let loose a missile. I mean, these are immense, complex problems, and they seem to have worked it all round and been able to do it. But coming to the larger issue, of course, is that moving ahead, I mean, as we adopt drones, there is one line of action is manned-unmanned teaming, and certainly it has its merits. But sometimes I feel that it's partly a cultural issue, that you're still hanging on to having a human being on the platform, particularly on the aviation side, because I think culture matters a little more to them, though it matters to us also who wear whites. That if not unmanned, then at least if I'm not going to be manned, then I need to be partially manned, at least have a man master, and that is controlling several unmanned assets. And therefore, you're still hanging on with that idea of having a human being up in the same domain, which is. So is this purely culture which is driving this change? Is it just a passing phase that we're going through manned unmanned and soon we'll go to unmanned unmanned? I mean, is this a stepping stone?
I mean, it's probably sort of one of those situations where all of the above applies. There are cultural issues. But if you see actually armed forces, many armed forces have made a lot of progress in overcoming many of the cultural issues. For instance, 20 years ago, people were very dismissive, the world over, of unmanned systems itself. Then now we are at a stage where we talk a lot about manned and unmanned. Now, the loyal wingman, etc. Now, in the way, the discussions are going, loyal wingman, at least one of the loyal wingmen is a human being, right. And it depends now, who's more loyal than the other and who's more capable than the other. Right. So even in that concept, from what I understand about it is that it's the unmanned wingman who will be controlled and put into harm's way. Now technology already exists to have two wingmen doing similar things which a manned two-man combat aircraft would do with somebody the wingman, the junior one, the wingman. Now we probably need to rethink this whole business of what does wingman mean. It's not a question of seniority or hierarchy or combat experience. Right. It would be now what do two unmanned aircraft or 3 or 10 in a swarm able to do. And I think the good part is, I think that there is now greater acceptance and a lot reduced cultural resistance to that. It's never easy. And if you remember our conversation some time back about the unease that airlines feel about passengers not wanting to step into and be passengers on an unmanned aircraft that goes from A to B over land or flies over the sea. So there is that issue there, and we need to understand those issues also, allowing for the fact that while technology exists to address safety issues and risk issues, cultural hesitation is also needs to be recognized, studied, and overcome. So in time, I agree with you that the proportion of sort of ISR capability, platforms, and greater weapons or even better and better weapons that might be launched by these platforms, we will probably see in all dimensions, more unmanned issues, and manned-unmanned will continue to have probably a role, but it might proportionately diminish. We may not welcome that happening, but it's a reality. And what if, the other side, like you brought out, it brings up, it enables sometimes more optimum operational and tactical decisions to be taken because of this facility that you have of, unmanned teaming. It might actually give us more operational and tactical flexibility, and perhaps thereby, better achieve strategic objectives. And we see that happening in the conflicts today. I think in the past week itself, we have seen, some fundamental shifts in warfare in our subcontinent that have taken place. And what the future might bring, we do not know. But I think it might be just better to, like you said, prepare for a future. And it's better that, we are ahead on the curve than our, neighbors.
So what you've said is absolutely true, sir, in the sense that I think moving ahead, either you have a long-range weapon itself, so you are unmanned all the way through.
Yes.
And as we discussed right in the beginning of this episode, where we were talking about platform versus weapon, weapon of course is unmanned, and therefore the platform. But if the platform, in places where you need the platform also, that means you're not launching only a weapon from your soil, but you need a platform to launch the weapon, be it airborne or be it shipborne, your or subsurface, whatever it is. If you're launching that weapon from a standoff range and you don't require a very complex platform to do that, then it lends itself to become unmanned also.
Yes.
It becomes easier because you're not looking at complex systems. It's essentially a weapon carrier, weapon truck, that you're carrying and positioning at a certain place,
Yes,
so that he can launch the weapons from there. Applies more, I would say, in expeditionary cases, or when you're going greater distances from your, or you're carrying out, deep ocean strikes where it's ranges beyond from where the part of the land, of course, dissipates as you go further and further away. So you might require a platform to bridge that gap, between as you go further away from your coastline. So that, I think, it flows into the same discussion, that while we have, the standard for configuration in a sense that even exists today is manned-unmanned. Where the ships are manned and your weapon is unmanned.
Yes.
Yeah, in a sense,
true.
that is
in
true.
a fundamental
Yeah,
sense, and that's been true for decades. Yes.
But I think what
Centuries,
might change
perhaps.
is that you change more to possibly an unmanned configuration, like we've seen in this Ukraine case also, where progressively your ships also become unmanned to quite an extent, and the weapon they launch is as it is unmanned, and therefore it gives you that reach and that range. So, I mean, sir, to conclude, it's of course this is always work in progress, your force structure, but I think now the wheels of change have to be spun faster. Would you agree with that, sir?
I think so. I think, to begin with, we need to think a lot more about it. And then, if our thinking, of people in charge, really speaking in various organizations, various countries, agree to the thought process leads to certain, decisions about force planning and force structuring and how we organize ourselves, that will matter. In a final sense, I suppose, in terms of exercising control in territories elsewhere, boots on ground will be important. But the kind of sort of technological wherewithal that enables that those boots on ground, so to speak, to be effective, will require, greater and greater inputs from unmanned, manned-unmanned and unmanned-manned, combinations. So even boots on ground will require a lot of unmanned support. And I guess it's good to see, those changes taking place. And at the same time, we should be probably, more cognizant of the risks involved in having these instruments without adequate controls, especially in the hands of non-state actors or state actors, like you mentioned, in say Pakistan's case, who don't adhere to certain, ethical standards and standards of propriety and indeed, methods of statecraft itself.
So I'd even conclude by fully echoing what you've said, sir. And I think while we have come out very well in Sindhur, but I think this opportunity needs to be utilized to carry out a totally dispassionate assessment, so that you're constantly ahead of the curve, sir. And I would say is that this exercise has to be done fast. It has to be done rapidly, and you need not even wait for a conflict for this to happen.
Absolutely.
Because that's a rather expensive way of learning your lessons. So if you're ahead of the curve at all times, you sort of future-proof your conflicts in many ways, and your deterrence posture also goes up as you adopt those measures. That being said, sir, it remains for me to thank you for taking part in this.
Thank you, Monty. We had a
always delightful
very
talking to you,
interesting
sir.
discussion.
Yes.
And